hand it over to our next person. Thank y'all.
Cool. Thank you so much, Isaac. Thank you so much to our interpretation team for helping us give better access during this webinar. My name is Dana. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm a collective member with Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in collective study. We know that it's an extremely heavy time in our global struggles, today being the day of the Nakba, as Israel continues to starve and murder Palestinians in Gaza. And there's also the ongoing tensions in Syria and the broader Middle East. And of course, the daily fascist violence and repression against our own peoples here on Turtle Island. So we are really, really grateful that you've all come to accept our offering to ground together in the land-based movement that's happening in Rojava. Just to give you a little bit of background, Movement Generation is a nonprofit collective based in Lishan and Bay Miwok territory in the San Francisco Bay Area. Our work is centered around ecological justice, restoring relationships to land, and helping to build the movement for a just transition through political education, culture shift work, and caring for the land. And we are so super excited today to be co-hosting this session with our friends and partners at New Economy Coalition and the Emergency Committee for Rojava. NEC is a national coalition of more than 200 organizations building the solidarity economy in the US. And ECR is a membership organization uplifting the Rojava experiment in feminism, pluralism, direct democracy, and environmentalism. So about a year ago, some of us got together in a backyard here in the Bay Area to learn from ECR members Debbie Bookchin and Arthur, one of today's speakers, about Rojava, a pluralistic, multi-ethnic, multi-faith, autonomous region of North and East Syria. We were really struck by the parallels between Rojava's political project and MG's own values and frameworks. So we thought that it would be valuable for us to get together with our broader community to share some lessons and organizing strategies from the collective governance and solidarity economies that the people of Rojava have been asserting for, I think, over a decade now. From local assemblies and regional autonomy to worker co-ops and reconciliation councils. Of course, this is not a utopian society. There are lots of complexities and contradictions, which we'll hear about today. You can go to the next slide, please. So today we're going to be hearing from ECR members Arthur and Clara, who will give an overview of Rojava, what the work looks like on the ground, and some of the lessons and challenges. And then we'll follow that up with longtime MG political homie Brooke Anderson, who some of y'all might know for her photography out in the streets. And Brooke is going to be drawing some connections between lessons learned from Rojava, ecological justice, solidarity economies, and more. And then in the last 20 minutes, we're going to have a 15-minute Q&A and then a closing. Please use the Q&A function to drop your questions. And throughout, I will try to read the chat. So if possible, please keep your chat messages short and sweet for the sake of time. Next slide. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so I'd love to go ahead and turn it over now to Arthur and Clara from the Emergency Committee for Rojava.
All right, hey y'all. Thanks for having us. We're really honored to be here today with you all. I'm Arthur. And before we get into discussing what life is like on the ground in Rojava, how society is organizing itself, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of some of the core ideas that really inform this revolution. And the first of those ideas is the principle of democratic confederalism. This is sort of the guiding political philosophy of the movement in Rojava and the broader Kurdish freedom movement in general. And what democratic confederalism means is really the idea of a society based on the self-governance of local communities and the coordination of those communities from the local on up all the way to the regional level. So
Arthur, really quick, is this the right slide for us to be on?
there should be a slide that has the core principles listed. Might be the next one. There we go. Values and principles of the revolution. Perfect. So again, the democratic part of democratic confederalism is talking about true self-governance, and the confederalist part is referring to this coordination from the bottom up, from the local outward. So at its core, this is really a radical anti-statist conception of democracy itself as being, again, rooted in grassroots self-governance. Another core issue is that of gender equality, what the movement refers to as women's autonomy. And the Kurdish freedom movement, Clara's going to talk a bit about the background and history, but the Kurdish freedom movement has come to see women's autonomy as really central to any movement for liberation. So rather than past historical movements which have treated women's equality as a sort of secondary issue, we'll sort it out after the revolution or something like that. For the Kurdish freedom movement, patriarchy is understood as being at the core of all forms of domination and exploitation throughout history. And so addressing that core issue of domination, the problem of patriarchy, is really centered throughout political life in Rojava and in the Kurdish movement. So that's not just a sort of historical analysis or sort of political philosophy, it's also an organizational principle. So as we'll get into a little bit later, when it comes down to the practice of how just the basic structures of governance and economy and defense are organized in Rojava, women's autonomy is at the center of that. Another core principle is that of ecology, or we could say social ecology. For those who are familiar with the term social ecology or the work of Murray Bookchin, you may be interested to hear that the Kurdish freedom movement was directly influenced by the thought of Murray Bookchin. In fact, Abdullah Öcalan, who is really the imprisoned Kurdish leader who's been imprisoned by the Turkish state since 1999. Abdullah Öcalan is really the philosopher behind the Kurdish freedom movement. He's a founding leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Öcalan referred to Murray Bookchin as someone he saw himself as a student of. And when it comes down to the movement's approach to ecology, there's really been a profound influence of social ecology on the way they conceive of the relationship between humanity and the rest of the natural world. So in the most general sense, the movement's philosophy about ecology is that human society, human economies, human structures should be brought into harmony with the rest of the natural world. Moving on to economy, the movement has a concept of what they call social economy. In Kurdish, it's aboriya javak. And really, it's the idea of a socialist economy at its core. The idea that resources, labor, property, all these things, at the end of the day, we should strive to organize a society where these things are based on democratic management and are allocated to serve the needs of society itself, the needs of communities, rather than being based on profit. So you can imagine, as we'll get into later, cooperative economics are featured prominently. And then lastly, another really important core principle of the Rojava Revolution is pluralism. We can think of it as cultural pluralism. And what they mean by that is basically the free, democratic coexistence of all of the region's diverse peoples. So the Kurdish movement is no longer just thinking about the autonomy of Kurdish people, and the liberation of Kurdish lands is something that's seen as a process that's just for Kurdish people. Really, there's a recognition that even in historic Kurdistan, there's a diversity of peoples that live there. And for Kurds to liberate themselves, they have to democratize society so that all people have the right to kind of celebrate and practice their own cultures, and practice self-determination in a holistic sense. So those are some of the core ideas. I think Claire is going to talk about the history of this movement and how it got to the revolution.
Okay, next slide, please. Great, thank you so much, Arthur. So my name is Clara. So what Arthur has just described is known within the Kurdish freedom movement as the new paradigm. And so I'm just going to walk us through how we got here, because the new paradigm has been very successfully implemented in northern Syria. So on the map here in the yellow part of Syria that you see. So the beginning of this story, although we could start anywhere in history, but we'll start with the founding of the Kurdish freedom movement and the Kurdistan Workers' Party, of which Abdullah Öcalan was the founder that Arthur spoke about briefly. And so that began in the 70s and 80s. And it began as a Kurdish nationalist Marxist movement, primarily. So if you look all the way to the left, you'll see the map, which has the four colors, which all of that highlighted territory is Kurdistan, so areas with majority Kurdish populations. And Kurds are split between four countries: Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And the Kurdistan Workers' Party started in earnest in Turkey, but very quickly the ideas and the organizing spread through all parts of Kurdistan, including into northern Syria. In the early 2000s, they changed their paradigm through realizing that the Marxist program and the nationalist Kurdish-focused program wasn't meeting their philosophical, spiritual, and revolutionary goals. And so they changed to the paradigm that Arthur spoke about. And then crisis meets opportunity. In 2011, the Syrian civil war started. And so cadres of the Kurdistan Workers' Party and also Kurds from around Kurdistan and the movement flooded into northeast Syria to help take advantage of the opportunity and to build up a new governance system in a vacuum that was left by the Syrian regime. And so since 2011, amongst a population of Kurds, Arabs, Christians, and others, they've been building up a pluralistic revolution based on these principles, and it's been very successful. And of course, when it rains, it pours. And so, in the midst of the sort of height of building of the revolution, ISIS attacked while the revolution was in full swing. So, with the support of the international coalition, the ground forces of Rojava, which are multi-ethnic Kurds and Arabs and a coalition of people against extremism, came together and defeated ISIS in Syria. And after that, they then became the governance structure in all of the former ISIS territory in Syria. So all of a sudden, the regions who had been living under ISIS for 3, 4, 5 years were now being introduced to and offered this new system and new paradigm. And in many places, it's had extreme success amongst the majority Arab territories in the south. In the south part of the Northeast. And so it's really a success story, an incredible story that the world doesn't talk about hardly enough, I believe. And so now we'll tell you what it looks like a little bit on the ground there. And both of us have been there and spent extensive time there, so we're speaking from our personal experience of what the situation looks like. So I'll hand it back over to Arthur now, and you can go to the next slide.
All right, thanks. Let's see. So, what does it look like on the ground in Rojava? How does society organize itself? I think this conversation really has to start with the system of communes. What they call communes in Rojava are really the building block of democratic confederalism, the kind of organizational vehicle through which this idea of community self-governance is actually put into practice. And in practice, what a commune is an organizational body, you could call it a local assembly or council, that is open and participatory, and it starts at the level of the scale of a neighborhood or a village. Technically, there's even some places where a commune is a smaller scale than what we would call a neighborhood. It may include only, maybe 5 city blocks. And the reason for that is really intentional, is this idea that for self-governance, participatory democracy to really take root, scale matters, because there's a certain depth of relationships between people, a certain intimacy in terms of not just how neighbors know each other, but the extent to which they really feel responsible for each other, look out for one another. And they've actually built their system of governance around this. So in contrast to the structure of a nation state form of governance, where decision-making and power and initiative, they all start up at the top and they flow downwards. Maybe we get to vote every once in a while or have a say in who it is that's governing us. The idea of democratic confederalism is to kind of turn that pyramid upside down, so that power and initiative and decision-making start at the base, at the grassroots level, with local communities themselves. So when you walk through neighborhoods and communities in Rojava, you will see community centers at the scale of the commune, which are sort of like the home of the neighborhood commune or the village commune. And this is a place where people come in and out every day. They gather, they talk to each other, they hold meetings, and they organize themselves to try to understand what the needs are of the community, and how to organize to address them. And they do this in a number of ways. At the most basic level, the structure of a commune is broken into distinct committees, which are based on different needs of society. So just as you might imagine, there's an education committee, there's a health committee, there's a defense committee, there's a culture and arts committee, there's a committee for women, committee for youth, for sports, all of these different aspects of society, all the way down at the neighborhood and village level, have formal structures. Then they have people who volunteer for those committees, are elected as co-chairs and delegates, and they coordinate the work of these committees, and then they federate out. So this is getting to the concept of federalism. So while the base level is at the commune level, neighborhoods and villages, people are getting together and making the decisions of self-governance at that grassroots level. You have to coordinate beyond that, right, to have a functioning society. So what they do is they elect delegates who are co-chairs, they call them. It has to be one man and one woman. Clara will have a chance to talk more about women's autonomy, but even just me trying to explain the structure of governance, you can't do that in Rojava without touching on women's autonomy, because it's institutionalized in every structure of society. So to coordinate outside of the village or the neighborhood, these delegates are sent out to the wider levels. And at each kind of concentric circle, as you move outward, there's the same mirroring series of committees, right? So you have the education committee of the commune is going to send a delegate out to meet with all of the co-chairs of all of the education committees in all of the communes for that city. And then that city is going to do the same thing to go all the way out to, they have different designations for these things, but those of us in the United States can think of as like the county level, or the state or regional level. So the other thing to think about when it comes to governance is, again, this principle of women's autonomy. So again, we'll get into this later, but it's really important to understand that it is structurally embedded into these structures of government. So moving on from governance to economy, I guess I'll ask for the next slide. Like we said, one of the core principles of the revolution is what they call social economy. And the main organizational vehicle for building up what they call a social economy is the cooperative sector. So many of you are probably pretty familiar, especially those coming here from NEC, what a worker cooperative is, right? A business in which workers collectively own and democratically manage affairs themselves. A big aspect of the Rojava Revolution has been not just to transform the system of governance to make it more communal and more democratic, but to try to transform the economy as well, away from what they called capitalist modernity into something moving towards a democratic form of socialism, an anti-state form of socialism. And so in the economy, the way that looks is, first of all, as the regime, the Syrian regime, withdrew from many of the Kurdish regions, the movement took over property that was held by the administration and collectivized it by giving it to local communes and councils, and the autonomous administration, which is the sort of full highest level regional coordinating body for this system of democratic confederalism in Rojava, has kind of reallocated that property based on the needs of society. That said, it's very much a mixed economy in Rojava. There's real limits to how far the cooperative economy has been able to develop. And that means that a kind of capitalist market economy is very much alive and well and a part of the reality in Syria. But you have these kind of two economies living side by side together. Those represented by the cooperatives, but also not just cooperatives, things like labor unions, things like the direct distribution of essential goods, which happens through the communes and is coordinated by the autonomous administration. No, things like cooking oil, diesel, bread, soap. Depending on where you are, you may get a lot of these basic goods just for free or highly subsidized from your neighborhood commune. So we'll talk a little bit later about kind of limitations and challenges, but that's the shape that the social economy takes. And these cooperatives exist throughout the economy in all the different sectors that you can imagine, from growing food to manufacturing to small scale shops and stores, restaurants, things like this. And very often the movement, the administration itself will prioritize providing capital and land and technology to people to start cooperatives, especially people who are particularly marginalized or displaced, women especially. There's an entire women's economy committee at the regional level that's dedicated just to building women's economic independence through the foundation of workers' cooperatives. And lastly, before moving on, I wanted to touch on self-defense. So as Clara was mentioning, this is very much a region at war. The revolution itself was made possible by the kind of chaos that came out of the emergence of this civil war and the weakening of the Syrian regime. But their problems did not end there. As soon as they declared autonomy, they came under attack by both ISIS, but also Turkey. So the Turkish state historically is a very nationalist state, right? The Kurdistan Workers' Party was really born out of the oppressive conditions that Kurdish people faced within Turkey. And so as you can imagine, just south of Turkey, right, in Syria, as soon as Kurdish communities and Kurdish majority communities, which of course it's not just Kurdish people, declared autonomy, the Turkish state immediately reacted with aggression by launching a number of invasions and occupations into the territory of Rojava, as well as providing sort of tacit support to ISIS fighters who were actively attacking communities in Rojava as well. So communities quickly had to organize their own forms of self-defense. And this takes a number of forms. One, at the largest level, is the military structure, the self-defense force of Northeast Syria, which is known as the Syrian Democratic Forces. And there's all kinds of acronyms under it. We won't even go into all of it. But in the self-defense forces, women's autonomy also plays a role. So there's all women's units like the Women's Protection Units, or YPJ, which have been featured very prominently in kind of the stories told about Rojava. These are the forces that defeated ISIS on the ground territorially, and really made possible the revolution by opening and holding open the sort of physical and political space in which society has been dramatically reorganized. But self-defense requires more than just protection of Rojava's communities from outside forces. It also has required internal security. So they have a structure called the Asayish, which is like an internal defense force. It also has an autonomous women's wing, and that's focused on mainly maintaining checkpoints and things like this, kind of within the territory of Rojava, and has also been required, especially because as ISIS lost territory, they moved from sort of standing army and governing structure to launching kind of terrorist attacks within society. And lastly, you have what's called the HPC. These are kind of the defense committees of the neighborhoods themselves. They're extremely grassroots. They're totally autonomous from any of the military structures. And these are organizations through which you can imagine it as like a volunteer fire department, but it's actually everyday people. Sometimes it's referred to as the grannies with guns. But these are like the everyday folks from the neighborhood who help patrol their streets when there's a threat. They train each other, they empower each other to look out for one another, and they address sort of those smaller level, more localized threats. But lastly, it's really important to understand that like the movement in Rojava really sees self-defense itself in a holistic way. That it's not just about picking up a gun and fighting enemies that are attacking your community. It's about the self-organization of the community itself. So they really emphasize things like education, political participation, consciousness raising, as not just important, but as a central aspect of what we even meaningfully see as self-defense itself. I think we'll hand it over to Claire now.
Thanks. Okay, next slide, please. That was a perfect lead-in to the next section that I'll be speaking about, which is the role of political education in the revolution in Rojava. So, of course, a revolution is made out of people, and it can only go so far and in whatever direction as people are interested in and supportive of. So, from the very beginning, the focus of the organizing bodies was to do political educations as often and as much as possible with the local population, with their neighbors. And so political education is built into the system of life in Rojava. Political education academy attendance is required or is cursory for participants who want to work with the autonomous administration, so who want to work in the communes or who want to work in the other bodies that have grown out of the autonomous administration as the revolution has matured. And so those academies can look like a few days, they can be a few weeks, they can be up to a month. And the curriculum is really about self-empowerment, so seeing each individual, seeing themselves as an agent of history, of politics, and of change, should they see something that needs to be changed. And in addition to that, about grounding the revolution in the global history of people-powered social change and revolutions in order to build a shared sense of purpose, which is the fuel, as the movement sees as the fuel for the political project. And this is really built into everyday life, as I said. So the communes themselves will sometimes hold educations. The autonomous women's movement will hold different educations. The community groups will do it. It is a decentralized process. And it also, at this point, now that we're over 10 years into building this system, they've built a new curriculum and a new school system for grade school and universities. There are about 5 autonomous universities in Rojava, and these curriculums reflect a very different sentiment, a very different reality than the existing Syrian regime curriculum in other parts of the country had. So you have now a generation who has gone through this schooling and learned from the time that they were 5 years old that patriarchy is bad. Here is why it developed, because 5,000 years ago the city-state began, and have a very different common sense about, one, what is normal and what is possible, politically and socially. So that is very exciting and is a permanent part of the revolution, even though at this point, the future of Syria is a little bit unclear going forward. That education is permanent. So next slide, please. Now I will talk a little bit more about women's autonomy, although Arthur gave a very excellent overview and introduction. The one thing I would add to introduce the system is that in the thought system of the Kurdish freedom movement, it grew out of a decolonial movement. And so the thinking was women essentially were the first colony. And so in order to decolonize ourselves and our system, we need to begin with women. And so in political education, this is something that is spoken about a lot, and it's contextualized in this way. So women are autonomous in all bodies. They have an autonomous women's arm. So that includes the legislature, the justice system, the military structures. And solidarity among women is considered very important and is considered another source of fuel for the revolution. And I want to be clear because sometimes it's not clear for people, but when we say women's autonomy, specifically in the military, we don't mean they have their own groups. We mean they have their own weapons cache and their own command structure. So at no point do they take orders from men. It's not possible within the system and within the thought system. They cooperate and they coordinate, but they have true functional and operational autonomy. Yeah, I see the hearts. Yeah, it's great. This was very cool, fighting ISIS, of course. So what does this look like in, yeah, totally. So what does this look like in the legislative and governing bodies? One, there is a 50% gender quota in all legislative bodies. So women are 50%. And then second, there is the co-chair system, which, next slide, please. When I was in Rojava, I took a series of many portraits of co-chairs together because I think it helps to show, you know, to just really see it, to be able to imagine. But these are some co-chairs from different organizations. As you can see, they're military. These are reconciliation councils. The presidents of the entire autonomous administration are in there. The co-chairs of the entire military forces are in there. The local police force is in there. They're in the top left-hand corner is the Democratic Islam Council. So as you can see, it's a real system and it's spread. There's probably tens of thousands of co-chairs in Rojava at this point, both past and present. And so it's a real lived into system that people are creating and recreating every day. It's not always easy, right? This was challenging to change mindsets so quickly. But one thing I heard a lot from specifically men and women was that women's participation in the military struggle did a lot to change the assumptions about what women could do very quickly because they said, okay, if they can fight ISIS, I guess they can run a council meeting. So that actually, that's a lesson we can take from Rojava, that women's military participation at a high level in combat does a lot to rapidly change highly patriarchal assumptions about women's abilities. And in addition, the co-chair system has changed the logic of what political leadership looks like in Rojava, because by definition, you are cooperating if you're in the position of executive authority. So this is another place where pluralism and sectarianism can come together. So if you look at these pairs, many of them are an Arab man and a Kurdish woman, or a Christian man and a Kurdish woman, or a Kurdish man and an Arab woman. And so it's a site where they're sort of redefining and renegotiating what political leadership looks like towards putting a value and a principle of cooperation as a skill at the top. So it's a very cool, interesting system, which is there have been others, sharing of power between men and women in different communities here um, in the northeast of the modern day United States. Some indigenous communities had similar structures, but as it exists in Rojava currently, it's a pretty unique structure on Earth. So pretty cool, pretty great. They have a social contract which establishes all of this in law. And you may have heard the phrase woman, life, freedom, which became well known during the Iranian uprising a few years ago. That comes out of the Kurdish freedom movement, and it is the unofficial slogan of the autonomous administration in Rojava. So next slide, please. I want to keep us on track, so I will try to go as quickly as possible, although this is a very interesting topic. So
Hey, Clara,
now, yeah.
just for a quick time check, let's go ahead and go until the top of the hour.
Okay. All right. Great. Thanks. Okay. So the justice system in Rojava is based on an ethic of reconciliation as the first line of defense, so to speak, of the community. So each commune, like Arthur was talking about, they have many committees. Each commune has a reconciliation committee. So for anything that happens, other than very extreme violent situations like rapes or murders can go directly to the courts or to the police. There's still an element of personal choice in that, but over time, it's become more common that it goes directly to the courts and the local community defense police. But ideally, everything that happens, so whether it's a trade dispute or a domestic violence situation or a disagreement over a sale or anything like this, any disagreement that there is in a community is supposed to first go to the Reconciliation Council in the commune. Then, if it can't be solved there through talking and coming to a mutual agreement, then it ladders up into the rest of the justice system. The next level will be another reconciliation council, which is specifically geared towards the type of dispute that it is. So that could be, there's a trade dispute council, right? And there's a domestic violence dispute council. There are various different ones. Then after that, if it can't be decided there, then it will go to the courts and the laws that are on the books. That Rojava has continuously tried to create new laws that are more just and more fair, but those will kick in. And in the courts, there's always 3 judges per case, and one of them has to be a woman. And then there are, at that point, if it reaches that point, and that there is punitive measures in the law, then people do go to jail. In Rojava, it's also a big security risk. ISIS is still very active in the society, and so it's complex. They're trying to do this system in a very difficult environment. But I will focus very briefly on the domestic issues reconciliation council, which is called the Women's House. So here you can see pictured a community level women's house. This is a Congress Star office, which is essentially the autonomous women's body of the neighborhood, but it doubles in this case as a malajin, a women's house. And so malajin are all staffed by women. They deal with all domestic issues. Both men and women bring cases to them. Over the revolution, as it's developed, more and more men have started bringing their own issues as well, as the system has gotten trust from the society. They seek to come to a solution, but if they can't, they go to the courts. And the Women's Autonomous Police Force is responsible for enforcing the decisions from the Malajin and the courts. So in addition, there is a all-women's village called Jinwar, where women can go and live if they're at risk and they need a safe harbor. And this also, the justice system being functional around, being formed around reconciliation, means that they have the opportunity to enforce laws in a way that is culturally relevant, sensitive, and sustainable. So, for example, in some areas, especially the last areas to be freed from ISIS, polygamy is still very much a norm, socially accepted practice, and part of people's lives. Officially, in the autonomous administration, the women's law, which was made by women's autonomous communities, has made it illegal, but it's not always enforced in communities in which that would be an undue burden on families. So, a revolution moves at the pace that people are ready for and interested in, and the political education element of the revolution comes in at that point to help do the slow process of changing minds and helping people see new possibilities for how they might live with some idea of what that might look like. But as we saw many times in Rojava, that sometimes goes in a different direction. So it's about the will of the people. So that's done. Now I think we'll just go over some really quick sum up lessons from Rojava and things to reflect on, and then we'll be done. So we can go to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to Arthur. And next slide.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that what you were just saying, Clara, is a really great transition here to this idea that a real revolution, especially a truly liberatory revolution, moves at the speed of popular consciousness. In other words, if rather than seeing revolution as just something that a new state does, some group takes power and sort of structurally reorganizes politics and the economy, and there's new rules now, and we're all good. The conception of revolution that the Kurdish freedom movement has is that of a very fluid, dynamic, bottom-up process. Yes, there is leadership in the sense that there are committed revolutionaries and revolutionary organizations that are out there taking initiative and intervening in society, are advancing the ideas of the revolution. But at the end of the day, if the goal is community self-governance, another way we could put that is participatory democracy, well, that requires participation. And people's participation is connected to their consciousness, their sense of self, their beliefs, their ideals, their sense of their own role and responsibility in their community, in society at large. And all these things create a very uneven development in the revolution. So anybody who's actually been to Rojava will tell you, there's communities where the communes, for example, are very, very lively and organized, and many people are participating in them. And the assemblies are well attended. and there's places where they're not. They're really not. And so because it kind of moves at the speed of consciousness, I think the movement also, not only does it have these very lofty ideals, but also has a real pragmatism to it. So as Clara was mentioning, you do have leadership that's elected as co-chairs, right? One man, one woman. And that leadership for every committee, for every governing body, whatever the structure is, they're going to keep the trains running on time. They're going to keep the work moving forward, whether or not people show up. At the same time, the door is always open to participation at the base and is strongly encouraged at every level. So another thing to point out is the social economy, right? This cooperative, anti-capitalist sector of the economy that is growing alongside the kind of old market economy. It has real limitations in Rojava. I think it's safe to say that the social economy is among the least developed aspects of the revolution, not necessarily politically in terms of their ideas and their aspirations, but in terms of practice, it's just proved very difficult to build a competing economy, especially during the war, right? So you have constraints on resources that they've had to deal with, right? Enormous amounts of resources have had to just go into defending their territory. And every dollar spent, every Syrian pound spent that's capital that could have been used to create more cooperatives, to redistribute wealth, to develop infrastructure, to better meet people's basic needs. And all of that is just going to hold back, slow down the social economy. Another major takeaway is this idea of dual power. The idea that a revolutionary movement transforms society not just by changing and influencing the existing structures of society, but by really building a new society within the shell of the old. And I think historically, people have thought about dual power as something happens before and during the revolution, but not as much about how the kind of dynamic of dual power continues after the revolution. And in Rojava, you really do see how these different structures, the old and the new, really exist alongside one another. And even in the governing structures of democratic confederalism, kind of more representative structures exist alongside the open participatory structures, and they kind of occupy the space that the other leaves empty. In other words, like we were saying earlier, nobody shows up to the assembly. Okay, well, the co-chairs are going to do what's needed to move the work forward. But if there's a lot of people showing up and participate, that's where the mandate comes from, and it's the community itself that gets to make those decisions. And then lastly, community is fundamental. It's not just about people's consciousness, but I know when I traveled throughout Rojava, the communes that I saw functioning the best were communes in communities that were really tight-knit, where people had a strong sense of responsibility to one another, of shared identity and belonging. And in other places, maybe some of the larger cities, where neighborhoods maybe were more just neighborhoods than meaningful communities, a lot of people living close in proximity together, where they didn't have that glue, that sense of being truly responsible for each other's well-being. These structures have a limited ability to really embody governance, because they're not being held together by community. So when I think about translating that back home, it makes me think that, like, if we're going to really build popular power, we have to build community alongside it. I'll shut myself up there. There's a lot more to be said. Maybe, Clara, you have things to add or subtract.
No, I think that was very well said. I will just end by saying that in Rojava, there's a lot of graffiti on the streets that say in Kurdish, "Xhevile Rojavaye," which means there is hope in Rojava, which is which is very true. It's amazing what has been accomplished there and is continuing day by day to be accomplished despite all the challenges, and in relationship with those challenges, meeting them, overcoming them, thinking about them, switching direction. So really organic and flowing in that way. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for joining.
Thank you so much, Arthur and Clara. So inspiring. I just wanted to uplift a couple of things from the chat, which I actually don't know if all the participants are able to see what we're seeing, but some messages were bottom-up process, Viva Rojava, and then somebody else shared, lack of community in the Seattle area is a major impediment to power building. And then lots of thanks. So I'll go ahead and pass it to Brooke.
Yeah. Can folks join me, whether it's a heart emoji or something in the chat, in thanking Arthur and Clara for the just incredibly detailed, clear, brilliant, based in direct experience knowledge that they've shared with us. They didn't get into it today, but the situation in Rojava is really intense right now. And I don't mean just 2025. I mean like right now, this week, today. And the fact that Arthur and Clara, your time and energy could be in so many other places right now, but the fact that you've chosen to spend it with us to share these lessons is so generous. And we receive that with gratitude, with a commitment to solidarity. I think y'all were going to share some words from Rojava with us, but one of those I remember is Havalti, like this idea of friendship, comradeship, compañerismo, but we take it in that vein. And I want to, in that, with that, I want to encourage folks. I think we're going to drop the donation link into the chat, but the Emergency Committee for Rojava is run in the same bottom-up, grassroots, scrappy, love for the freedom movement, love for the people way. And so we want to honor this commitment from Arthur and from Clara on behalf of the Emergency Committee to for Rojava by just throwing, money is the currency. It's love we feel, but in the capitalist system, it's our Venmos, it's our click on a button that we show that love. So let's send them some resources as thank you. And then, yeah, hi, I'm Brooke. I'm on staff of the Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project. And it was about a year ago that we started really building this bridge between the Emergency Committee for Rojava and Movement Generation, and then bringing in our dear friends from the New Economy Coalition into that. And so I wanted to just share some reflections and sort of synergies between our work, or how we think about just transition, how we think about ecological justice, and the work that's happening on the ground in Rojava. And I want to just name that sounds like a what can we learn, which can be a little bit extractive. We're not wanting to just pull out the lessons for our own sake, but the real work is like, how do we support, defend, and protect this liberatory project in Rojava, so that it exists as a model that we and the rest of the world can learn from and can uphold. So, maybe by way of sort of where to start with that, let's move to the next slide. I've got a couple bullet points I wanted, and let's do one more slide after that. Thank you, Ellen. A couple thoughts. The first is, how many folks here, you can do a reaction, have seen Movement Generation's Eco Means Home presentation? This idea that there's a relationship between economy and ecology, in particular those first three letters, eco, which means in its origin, Greek means home, right? So that ecology is the study of home. It is the deep, intimate understanding of the relationships of home, and that economy is the management of home, right? And so we know that the ecological, economic, political conditions of home in northeastern Syria is very different than those same conditions on Tlingit land in southeast Alaska, different than the conditions for the Zapatistas in Chiapas, different than the conditions for the landless workers movement, the MST in Brazil, and very different than the conditions of youth on the ground in East Oakland on Ohlone territory here in the Bay Area. So it's a fallacy, right, to think that we can just copy, paste, replicate what the Rojavan Revolution has done in our places. But there's a couple key lessons, places of alignment about how change happens that I want to lift up. So the first is just, we know that nation states are not the answer. So what Abdullah Öcalan came to, that the revolutionary project is not a replacing of a capitalist nation with a worker state nation, that idea is deeply rooted in ecological principles, right? What Arthur said, that scale matters, right? That we turn power upside down, that we start with local communities themselves. We talk about that as we have to govern at the smallest scale of the thing that you're trying to govern. For instance, at the scale of a household, a neighborhood block, a classroom, a workplace, a watershed, a food shed. So that those most impacted by the consequences of decisions are the people making those decisions. Another way to say that is that those who make decisions have to be in a reflective, responsive relationship to the consequences of those decisions. That's why the block by neighborhood principle of governing is so essential, why women's councils should decide women's health issues, right? We also say, I'm just going to pause to make sure, am I speaking too fast? Am I doing okay? Yeah, somebody slow me down. Great, thank you. Another principle that hit us really hard when we heard about the freedom movement in Rojava is this idea that we've long said, if you're not prepared to govern, you're not prepared to win, right? What we are learning from Rojava, what Rojava is teaching us, is that it does not matter if you are suddenly handed a power vacuum or an opportunity to govern. If you haven't built a culture of self-governance, people won't take to it. People can't do it at scale. So our work as organizers is to shift culture toward practicing governance everywhere, right? Housing cooperatives, worker cooperatives, unions, neighborhood mutual aid associations, transformative justice healing circles, participatory budgeting, land co-stewardship and occupation, right? And that we have to fight the bad and build the new at the exact same time. So many of our US-based social movements, we've built up muscle memory for fighting the bad, and our capacity for liberatory imagination has atrophied. We're so busy fighting evictions that we only see rent control as our North Star, not decommodifying housing. We're so busy fighting firings that we see the fight for 15 in a union as our North Star, not the end of selling our labor to those who would use it to destroy land, water, air, our lives. Rojava is fighting a literal war, being drone attacked by Turkey, and still committing time, energy, resources, and vision toward their liberatory project. We also know, we often talk about the way that worldview and culture make participation in an old economy or an old way of organizing home make sense to the people. In a US context, It is ideas like white supremacy, cis heteropatriarchy, manifest destiny, the American dream, consumerism, ableism, radical individualism. Y'all can throw all the other examples into the chat, right? But we know that these ideas uphold and maintain an extractive and exploitative relationship to land and labor. As Clara said, thank you, Clara, women were the first colony, right? As Arthur said, revolution moves at the speed of consciousness. And so we're learning from the freedom movement in Rojava the necessity of deep investments in multi-generational political education to shift toward a more feminist, pluralistic, egalitarian society. And as Arthur said, that these things have to be embedded in decision making, structurally embedded, lifted up by economic self-determination through cooperatives, and given safe harbor, like in Jinwar. And the last thing I'll name, because I want to get to your questions, the Q&A is popping off. So much fire in the Q&A. I'll just say, toward the challenges, and thank you for your transparency or vulnerability, the authenticity of naming where things are hard and incomplete. Transition is the process of navigating contradictions. We've often said in movement generation that the future arrives unevenly. We are always at once living in the extractive, exploitative economy and trying to feed and grow a regenerative economy. And so, Rojava, we hear you talking about building a more ecological economy at the same time as being bombed. We hear you moving toward abolition and then still navigating these questions of police and courts and what to do with the remains of ISIS. And so thank you for being both oppositional and visionary at the same time. We know we have to build up these models of the new world, prove that they can work, draw down more resources to support them at the same time that we're trying to divest from and move more energy, resources, and cases away from the old. So we know that being in this moment, as Grace Lee Boggs talks about this, what time is it on the clock of the world, is a minefield of contradictions. But the North Star, right, for us is shifting economic control to communities, democratizing wealth, advancing ecological restoration, guided by traditional ecological knowledge. And in our context, that includes land back and reparations, but really driving racial justice and social equity and relocalizing production and consumption, all the while retaining and restoring cultures and traditions. And so we also see your federalism as translocal organizing. We should be doing this work so we can meet the Rojavan people where they're at. And we see you building on the ground connections between Palestine, the Zapatistas, the MST. So thank you for your internationalism. There's so much more to be said. I hope this is the beginning of a great friendship and a great solidarity. And so maybe I'll pass it back with love and with gratitude so we can get to our questions.
Thank you, Brooke. Thank you again so much to Arthur and Clara for giving so much amazing context, history, helping us dive into some of the strategies and what the work looks like on the ground. We have so many great questions in the Q&A, and we're definitely not going to get to all of them. So we'll try to compile them and maybe get some of them answered via email. But I was going to uplift, we'll start with maybe 2 questions that feel really important for the moment. And I'll put them both out there, and whoever wants to answer can take them. But quite a few folks were asking about what the latest move by the current administration in Syria means for the movement in Rojava. And then we're also interested in hearing a little bit more about what caring for the natural environment actually means and looks like in the daily life of the communes in Rojava. How is women's work linked to territorial defense and ecology? So I'll leave it up to you which question either of you want to answer first.
Clara, do you want to take first crack at the current situation in Syria?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I was doing a little typing in yeah. So there are two parallel current events processes happening right now that are relevant to Rojava. The first, this is just to make sure everybody is on the same page. The first is that the dictator of Syria fell in December and was replaced by a man named Ahmed al-Shara or al-Jolani, who was the leader of a jihadist group. And now he is making signals that he is trying to moderate himself and make a Syria for Syrians, but it's unclear how he will govern. The Kurdish region, the other parallel process is that the Kurdistan Workers' Party, shorthand in Kurdish acronym PKK, have announced that they are disbanding and disarming. And Turkish attacks on Rojava over the past 10 years have all been predicated on the fact that, on the idea or the premise that Rojava is a risk to Turkey because of the existence of the PKK in Syria on their border. There is a good woman, Amy Austin Holmes, who did a study of like 3,000 cross-border attacks from Turkey to Rojava. In the same time period, there was 12 back to Turkey. So it's complete fiction. But now that the PKK has announced that they're disbanding, Turkey is signaling, not strongly, but they're signaling through some ceasefires on some fronts, because they're still attacking Rojava, that they will stop attacking Rojava. The new leader of Syria, Ahmed al-Shara, was supported by Turkey in his group, and so has a rapprochement with Erdogan. So now that Turkey has backed off of Rojava a little bit, it gives them more space to be able to negotiate with the new Syrian interim government for what a decentralized Syria might look like. The Syrian Democratic Forces, which are the military forces of Rojava, have made an agreement with the central government in Damascus. It's really an agreement to make an agreement. It's kind of an agreement that we're not going to fight right now, and what we want is a unified Syria and no more fighting to end this war. But of course, they are negotiating really hard to keep the gains that they've made, at least in their areas. So to keep local governance, to keep the co-chair system, to keep the ethos, to keep control over the curriculum in their areas. So they're negotiating for all of these things. The thing is that the forces in Rojava, it's not as if in Syria they're at all weak. They're about 5 times bigger than the forces loyal to the government in Damascus. They're better trained. They've been trained and equipped by the Americans for about 10 years. So this isn't, in the inter-Syrian context, it's not even a competition, really. The problem is geography. There's a big desert between them and Damascus. So But of course, there are many other international players who might weigh in to bolster the central government and sort of lessen Rojava's hand at the negotiating table, because the central government wants to keep as much control as they possibly can, especially because the majority of all of the oil in Syria is in Rojava's territory. So that's the current situation. It's really like we'll see. There's a lot of moving parts, but it does seem like everybody is trying to end this, in one way or the other. There are like some red lines, right? Like they're not gonna, I hopefully accept, uh, you know, like certain things, but it's a wait and see. I'm like cautiously optimistic because why not? Why not? But Trump also yesterday or the day before lifted all sanctions from Syria, which does a lot to bolster the hand of the government in Damascus because it will give them more legitimacy in the international arena as well as help them economically. Okay.
Yeah, so
A
true.
little bit of geopolitics, like, there's.
No, so true. It's a really good point, Clara. And just to tag off of that too, just encourage people to keep in mind that whatever structures and practices of the Rojava Revolution that are not officially recognized by Damascus as a part of this unfolding negotiation will certainly continue on in a sort of dual power form. So just like everything else about the revolution, it continues to be fluid. There was a question about ecology, which I could take a quick crack at because it's an important topic. The truth is that if it's true that the social economy is one of the less developed aspects of the revolution in the grand scheme of things, it may be safe to say that ecology is probably the least developed on the ground in practice. And that is not because the movement does not take ecology seriously. It mainly has to do with the conditions in which they're organizing. So there have been sincere efforts, and to name a few, there's been large campaigns of planting trees. Much of Rojava was kept from planting trees. It was literally a federal crime to plant trees in the Kurdish region under the Assad regime because it was meant to be kept as monocrop wheat and oil production and nothing else. So the movement's trying to change this, bring back not just trees, but to also diversify agricultural practices, try to phase out pesticides, bring in more organic forms of agriculture. Also things like cutting down on garbage and building recycling infrastructure. Honestly, a lot of things that many folks may see as sort of really basic environmentalism in Rojava is a big deal and a big challenge because of the conditions. And also just sort of, I don't know if I quite want to say cultural, but in terms of people's consciousness, again, um, there is just a widespread practice of throwing your garbage out of the window. And it's a constant conversation where people in the movement are out there in the neighborhoods talking to people. Hey, let's take responsibility for our community. Let's not throw garbage around everywhere. Let's try this new recycling thing. Let's plant some trees. But it's all moving very slowly. They have created official committees and councils around ecology. And that's, I think, a real promising sign that they're taking these issues seriously, wanting to develop further. Lastly, on ecology, Rojava is, here's another contradiction, is an oil producing region. There's a real strong desire to move away from that and increase things like solar production of energy. But because of the sanctions and the conditions of the war, it's been very, very difficult to get technology into Rojava to actually develop that sector as an alternative means of energy production. And also related to ecology is the question of water, which has been weaponized by Turkey throughout the conflict. So the Tigris and Euphrates River, they flow from Turkey into Syria, not only as a source of water itself, but also as a source of electricity production. And Turkey at various times has cut off the flow of that water just to weaponize against the people of Rojava and try to make the region sort of unlivable. So I'll end it there. I don't know if we have time for more questions or if we have to move on.
Yeah, just to be mindful for the interpreters to be able to log off. I'm sorry, I know we're a couple minutes over, so we'll have to end it here. Thank you so much, Arthur and Clara. Thank you so much, Brooke. Thank you. So much gratitude to the interpreters, the interpretation team. Just want to uplift one more time. Please connect with the Emergency Committee for Rojava by visiting defendrojava.org and drop them a donation. Also, defendrojava.org/donate. And yeah, feel free to connect with MG, with New Economy Coalition and ECR, so we can be organizing together and practicing solidarity with each other always. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Is Richard Wolff on?